All right, Greg. Last but not least, let's dive into the defensive backs. Doing this on a Monday this week so that everybody has plenty of time to hear your breakdowns or watch youtube.com/Ross Tucker NFL before the first round Thursday night. Let's start with corners. And it seems like it's a pretty good class for corners. Obviously, there's a couple guys whose names pop up in the top 10 a bunch. Was there a guy that jumped out to you?
I mean, if I had to make a list, you know how I feel about lists, Ross. But if I had to make a list, I'd probably start with Christian Gonzalez from Oregon. Really good size. You know, in this league, at some point, you have to line up and be able to play press man coverage. That's the way the league has evolved with a lot of the shorter passing games. If you just play off coverage and you don't disrupt receivers, you're going to struggle because with the quicker game, pass games in the league, it's sometimes, depending on down and distance, it becomes more difficult to get to the quarterback. So instead of being able to disrupt the quarterback, you have to disrupt receivers off the line of scrimmage. So press man is a necessity in this league for corners. And I think that, we're dealing with a guy that has tremendous length. He has size, length, speed, fluidity, competitiveness. He makes it look easy at times. He's smooth as silk.
Is there a negative there? Because this is all I've heard about this guy. I mean, I don't know that I've heard a negative yet about him.
I don't think that there's a big time negative on tape. There's always a couple of things that you need to clean up. At times in press man, he got back on his heels, and that sometimes would negatively impact his balance. And to compensate, sometimes he'd reach and just not quite be on balance. There were times which this happens to most corners just because when they're playing good receivers, but there were times he lost contact with the receiver at the top of his route stem and then had to recover, but he's got the fluidity and quickness to recover. I think that one of the main things that's rarely talked about with corners and is critical, and for the most part, Gonzalez can do it, but there were times he didn't, is you have to be able to stop. It's true with receivers and corners, Ross. You have to be able to stop. No one thinks about that. Because think of if a receiver runs a curl route or a comeback route, at some point you have to be able to stop without taking 5, 6, 7 steps. Just like a receiver has to be able to stop so that he doesn't take 7 steps to break off a comeback. So, I think that there were a few times where Gonzalez just didn't quite stop. But these are more nitpicks because you asked me, what shows up on tape. Overall, you're dealing with a high-level corner prospect that has every trait you would like to see for today's NFL.
All right. The guy that I'm really intrigued by is Devin Witherspoon from Illinois, Greg. 5'11 and a half, 181. He doesn't have great size. He also is not a burner. So
No.
how good must this guy be to be ranked in the top 10 of these drafts with being not having great size or great speed?
Well, it's funny you say that because that's why you have to watch full games, because I watched a number of games, obviously, in which receivers ran by him. And the ball was not thrown to the receiver, but the receivers ran by him. That's one of the questions you have with Witherspoon. Now, he did run really well on his separate pro day because he was injured. So we'll see, but that's what the tape shows. Particularly when he was in off coverage, he was a little slow to open up, flip his hips, and turn to run. But what you really love about this kid, and I don't know if you got a chance to see him doing any games, is this kid is feisty. He's competitive. He's kind of a pain in the ass. He plays pissed off. You love the swagger with which he plays. I guarantee that defensive back coaches will love to have this kid in their room and on the field. He plays with such a high level of competitive toughness, and he does have quick, explosive feet. He's aggressive and decisive in his reactions. There's no hesitation in how he plays. He might get beat once in a while, but there's absolutely no hesitation in the way he plays.
So then you got the flip side to that, Greg. You've got Joey Porter Jr., who has great length and great speed, but isn't typically ranked as high as Witherspoon or thought to go as high as Witherspoon. So obviously something is missing there.
Well, he tended to be very handsy and grabby throughout routes. And you know from doing college games, Ross, that you can do that more in college football. You can't do that in the NFL. So he'll need to get that cleaned up. But you're dealing with a guy that's a little freakish. He's over 6'2". His arm length, think about this, Ross, his arm length is 34 inches. That's freakish. So he has everything you want to line up and be a press man corner, which is essentially what he is. And we know the importance in today's NFL of that boundary X wide receiver, the receiver who lines up to the short side of the field. He's the only receiver to the short side, very often on the back side of three receivers to the other side. And you need corners that can match up man to man, play both press and off. He is a quintessential press man corner. He's got height. He's over 6'2". He's, about 195. He's got good speed, but that arm length, he can just stick out those arms and he can disrupt receivers' routes. And because his arm length is so long, he can do that without losing his balance. So, he looks the part for sure, but he's definitely going to have to clean up the fact that he's very handsy and grabby throughout routes.
Gosh, I would have killed for 34-inch arms. Killed for 34-inch arms. All right, and then you got some other guys, Greg. I'm curious who jumps out to you out of this group. I'll throw a bunch at you. DJ Turner, Keely Ringo, Deontay Banks, Emmanuel Forbes, Julius Brents, Cam Smith. Was there any of those guys that you really liked?
Yeah, Deontay Banks. In fact, again, if I had to make a list, he'd be my number 2 corner. He's another guy that has great length. He's 6 feet. He's 197. His athletic testing measurables were terrific. He is another press man corner. When you watch, he played in the Big Ten, and you always want to see corners play against Ohio State, not only because of Marvin Harrison, but I think they have 3 5-star receivers. So you want to see, guys match up, certainly to Harrison, but to anybody at Ohio State. And he had some really, really good press man reps with Marvin Harrison and some others as well. Rashee Rice from SMU, I believe. So he's another one of those guys that has size, length, athleticism, really good in press man. He can play zone as well. So to me, he's scheme versatile. But I think you look at him and say, this guy is a press man corner, and that's what he is. And he's really good at it. And I really, really liked his tape a lot.
So I know he's thin, Greg, but Emmanuel Forbes had 6 pick sixes in college football. I mean, Greg, you're good if you have 6 pick sixes. Like you figured something out to be able to do that. I feel like that translates to the next level. What did you see from Forbes?
Yeah, Forbes is an outlier and an exception because he's 166 pounds. So you have to decide what that means to you. He's 6'1". Again, his testing measurables are really, really good. They played a ton of off coverage. I mean, he can play press. You saw it on tape. But at Mississippi State, they played a ton of off coverage. I think he's really good in zone. He showed a good feel for spacing. He read route concepts. I thought he played really well with his eyes, which, as you hear that all the time in cornerback and defensive back meeting rooms, that it's about, alignment, assignment, and playing with your eyes in zone coverage. Because he's long, stride length is a factor for him. He can eat up ground. It's hard to get over the top of him because he understands how to use his length and his size. So you just have to decide what 166 pounds means to you. Is his length and higher level athleticism and savvy and understanding enough to compensate for his really thin frame? I can't answer that. Teams have to answer that.
What about Ringo, Greg? Because that's another one where I see, okay, Georgia, I remember the pick 6 against Bama. He's 6'2". He's really fast. That's another one that I'm wondering, what is it, just a technique thing? What's his deal?
Yeah, he came out of high school as the number 1 corner prospect in the nation. He was a top 20 recruit. obviously, because, all that got him to Georgia. That's why he's at Georgia. He's got size, as you said. He ran well. He doesn't play to that speed on tape. He's certainly most comfortable playing press, but I think he's got some issues. He's very straight line, linear in his movement. He's tight hipped. He's a perfect example of what I was saying earlier. He can't stop. You can run curls, comebacks all day long against him. He just really has a hard time stopping. And because he knows that that's an issue, he has a glaring tendency to grab receivers at the top of the route stand. That has to be cleaned up. I've been told he's working with Richard Sherman, obviously someone really good to work with, incredibly smart, terrific player in the league for a long time. But he needs to clean up some things, or he's going to have a tough time in the league.
Interesting. When we come back, I want to transition to the safeties in this year's class. All right, Greg. It's interesting, as I said, let's talk safeties, but it feels like there's some disagreement as to just what Brian Branch from Alabama is. I've seen him listed as a corner. I've seen him listed as a nickel. I've seen him listed as a safety. That usually tells me he must be pretty good. He must be able to do a bunch of different things if he's listed at 3 different positions. What do you see from Branch? What do you think he is?
Well, what I think and know he is a terrific football player. This guy is really a good player. And, there's one thing he does, which no one talks about, and is kind of a lost art, Ross. He tackles. He is a great tackler. But he is scheme versatile. Getting to your point about where do you play him, he predominantly played in the slot at Alabama, but he can play safety. I think you could play him at safety in your base. You could play him in the slot in your sub, and he's just a really, really good player. He plays with his eyes exceptionally well. It's funny. I know you were not at the combine this year, but that drill they use for receivers where they run that gauntlet and they just throw the ball to them?
Yeah.
They do that with DBs as well. Well, he looked like a receiver running through that. He caught everything. He's such an easy player. Now, there'll be people who look at his size, 5'11 and 5/8, 190. His 40 time was not great. His athletic testing measurables were not great, but he's just a really, really good player. He was one of my favorite players to watch on tape, and I just think he'll be a really good player in the league. And I think he'll play in the slot, and I think he'll play some safety.
I want to get to some of the other safeties. My guy I watched a lot the last couple of years, really interesting, kind of reminded me a little bit of the guy the year before in Jaquan Brisker. They both played at Lackawanna Junior College before going to Penn State. That's Jair Tig Brown, Greg. He's one of those guys that it felt like the ball found him or he found the ball somehow.
Yeah, I really liked his tape a lot. I think he's a really, really good player. Now, he's a guy that, people might look at his 40 time and say that's a problem, but I think he's one of the better safety prospects in this draft with his combination of traits, his versatility to play multiple roles. I mean, when Penn State went to sub on third down, he was often in the box. He was on the line of scrimmage. He blitzed. At his core, he's probably a back-end safety. Now, despite the 40 time, the tape showed very good play speed and range to play both split safety, which you don't need as much, and I even think he can play snaps at post safety in single high coverages. But, he matched up man-to-man on tight ends. He matched up man-to-man on slot receivers. He rushed, as I said, as a blitzer. I think that this guy is a really strong prospect, and he did in some ways remind me of Jaquan Brisker. Brown. To me, he's just a really good player, really good prospect.
Any other safeties jump out to you, whether it's Antonio Johnson or either one of the Illinois kids, Jartavius Martin or Sidney Brown? Gosh, Illinois had a lot of DBs.
Yeah, I really like Jartavius Martin, and I'm very curious to see how he's seen in the league because he played safety and corner. Another guy in some ways like Branch. Martin also played outside corner, though. But, I mean, he's got a ton of versatility to his game. So the question is, how does a team and a coaching staff see him in the context of their defense. I mean, you're dealing with a guy that played, in 2022, he predominantly played slot, by the way. He played 500 snaps in the slot. He played about 200 snaps at safety, and he played almost 100 snaps at outside corner. Think about that for a minute. And he was good in every single spot. So the question is, what is he in your defense? But I can tell you one thing. He is a really good player. In some ways, he's like a lower level Brian Branch. But Martin was the guy of the two quote unquote safeties that I really liked in the Illinois defense.
Well, I really like talking football with Greg Cosell each and every week here on the Ross Tucker Football Podcast. Can't wait to dissect the draft with you, Greg, next week. Can't believe it's here already. Check him out on social media at Greg Cosell. Thank you so much, Greg.
Thanks, Ross.